Welcome to a very brief discussion on phenomenology and existentialism. Now, it is said that whenever a narration reports the life of a single individual, it is precisely a phenomenological study that describes the meaning of several individuals of their lived experiences. So, the first question which comes in front of us, what is exactly this lived experience? Well, phenomenology is the study of structures of consciousness as experienced from the first person point of view. The central structure of an experience is its intentionality, that is, its being directed towards something or as an experience of or about some object. So when I say that I think, so immediately you are supposed to ask me, what do you think? Because the sentence seems incomplete. When I say I see, then you are supposed to ask, what do you see? Because the subject I, who is performing the function of thinking or seeing, expects a predicate, or maybe a person who is perceiving expects the object of perception, and that is why it is always being directed towards something. Now, as an experience is directed towards an object by virtue of its content or meaning, that which represents the object, together with appropriate enabling conditions. Phenomenology as a discipline is distinct from, but related to, other key disciplines in philosophy such as ontology, epistemology, logic, and ethics. We all know about that. This phenomenology has been practiced in various guises for centuries, but it came into its own in the early 20th century in the works of Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and others. Now let's talk about what are the primary issues of phenomenology. The primary issues are intentionality, consciousness, Kalia, and first person perspective. Now, these have been prominent even in the recent philosophy of mind debates. That is why phenomenology is commonly understood in either of the two ways. Either it is understood as a disciplinary field in philosophy, as we all know, or it is also understood as a movement in the history of philosophy. There are two different approaches of understanding phenomenology. The discipline of phenomenology may be defined initially as the study of the structures of experience or consciousness. Literally, phenomenology is the study of phenomena, appearances of things, or things as they appear in our experience, or the ways we experience things, thus, the meanings things have in our experience. Phenomenology studies conscious experience as experience from the subjective or necessarily the first person point of view. This field of philosophy is then to be distinguished from and related to the other main fields of philosophy, such as ontology, where we discuss the study of being or what is, epistemology, or the aspect which discusses the study of knowledge, its validity, and its process, logic as the study of valid reasoning, and ethics as the study of right and wrong actions, etc. Now let's understand the discipline as a historical movement. The historical movement of phenomenology is the philosophical tradition launched in the first half of the 20th century by thinkers like Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Jean-Paul Sartre, etc. In that movement, the discipline of phenomenology was prized as the proper foundation of all philosophy, as opposed, say, to ethics or metaphysics or epistemology. The methods and characterization of the discipline were widely debated by Husserl and his successors, and these debates continue to the present day. Now, it is to be noted here that the definition of phenomenology offered above will thus be debatable, for example, by Heideggerians, but it remains the starting point in characterizing the discipline. However, our experience is normally much richer in content than mere sensation. Accordingly, in the phenomenological tradition, phenomenology is given a much wider range addressing the meaning things have in our experience, notably the significance of objects, events, tools, the flow of time, the self, other, as things arise and experienced in our life world, preferably called as Lebenswelt. Now let's try to understand it as a discipline. Philology as a discipline has been central to the tradition of continental European philosophy throughout the 20th century. Basically, phenomenology studies the structure of various types of experiences ranging from perception, thought, memory, imagination, emotions, desire, and volition to bodily awareness, embodied actions, and social activities, including our linguistic activities. Now, the structure of these forms of experience typically involve what Husserl called intentionality, which means the directedness of experience towards things in the world, the property of consciousness that it is a consciousness of or consciousness about something. That being said, our experience is directed towards, represents, or intends things only through particular concepts, thoughts, ideas, images, etc. These make up the meaning or content of a given experience and are distinct from the things they present or mean. Now let's talk about what is exactly consciousness in the phenomenological sense. The basic intentional structure of consciousness we find in reflection or analysis involves further forms of experience. Thus, phenomenology develops a complex account of temporal awareness within the streams of consciousness, spatial awareness, notably in perception, attention, distinguishing focal and marginal or horizontal awareness, awareness of one's own experience like self consciousness in one sense, self awareness, that is, awareness of oneself, the self in different roles as thinking, acting, etc. But it also includes embodied actions like kinesthetic awareness of one's movement, purpose, or intention in action, more or less explicit. Awareness of other persons in empathy, intersubjectivity, collectivity, and so on. Linguistic activity involving mean, communication, understanding, and others. Social interaction including collective action, and everyday activity in our surrounding life world in a particular culture. There are different grounds of our consciousness. In different dimensions, we find various grounds enabling conditions, which are conditions of the possibility of intentionality, including embodiment, bodily skills, cultural context, language, and other social practices, even social background and contextual aspects of intentional activities. Thus, phenomenology leads from conscious experience into conditions that help to give experience its intentionality. Traditional phenomenology has focused on subjective, practical, and social conditions of experience. Recent philosophy of mind, however, has focused especially on the neural substrate of experience, on how conscious experience and mental representations or intentionality are grounded in brain activity. Now, it is to be noted here that it remains a difficult question how much of these grounds of experience fall within the periphery of phenomenology. Cultural conditions thus seem closer to our experience and to our familiar self understanding than do the electrochemical workings of our brain, much less our dependence on quantum mechanical states of physical systems to which we belong. The cautious thing to say is that phenomenology leads in some ways into at least some background conditions of our experience, which are, of course, the lived experiences. What does it study? Phenomenology studies structures of conscious experience as experienced from the first person point of view along with relevant conditions of experience. The central structure of an experience is its intentionality, the way it is directed towards its content or meaning towards a certain object in the world. We all experience various types of experiences, including perception, imagination, thought, emotion, desire, volition, and action. Thus, the domain of phenomenology is the range of experiences including all these types, among others. Experience includes not only relatively passive experience as in vision or hearing, but also active experiences as in walking or hammering a nail or kicking a ball. The range will be specific to each species of being that enjoys consciousness. Our focus is on our own human experience. Not all conscious beings will be able to practice phenomenology as we do. Now, there are some unique features of these consciousness studies. Conscious experiences have a unique feature. We experience them, we live through them or perform them. Other things in the world we may observe or engage, but we do not experience them in the sense of living through or performing them. This experiential or first person feature, that of being experienced, is an essential part of the nature or structure of conscious experience. As we say, I see, I think, I desire, or I do. This feature is both a phenomenological and an ontological feature of each experience. It is a part of what it is for the experience to be experienced, that is phenomenological, and part of what it is for the experience to be, that is ontological. Now, how shall we study conscious experience? We reflect on various types of experiences just as we experience them. That is to say, we proceed from the first person point of view. However, we do not normally characterize an experience at the time we are performing it. In many cases, we do not have that capability. A state of intense anger or fear, for example, consumes all of one's psychic focus at the time. Rather, we acquire a background of having lived through a given type of experience, and we look to our familiarity with that type of experience, hearing a song, seeing a sunset, thinking about love, intending to jump a hurdle, and so on. So, broadly speaking, there are three peculiar methods by which we do phenomenology. Classical phenomenologists practice some three distinguishable methods. Number one, we describe a type of experience just as we find it in our own past experience. Thus, Husserl and Merleau-Ponty spoke of pure description of lived experiences. Number two, Heidegger and his followers spoke of hermeneutics, the art of interpretation in context, especially social and linguistic context. Number three, in the end, all the classical phenomenologists practiced analysis of experience, factoring our notable features for further elaboration. Now, there are some other recent interpretations as well. These traditional methods have been ramified in recent decades, expanding the methods available to phenomenology. Thus, there is a fourth way where, in a logico-semantic model of phenomenology, we specify the truth conditions for a particular type of thinking. Say, where I think that dogs chase cats, or the satisfaction conditions for a type of intention. Let's say, where I intend or will to jump that hurdle. And then there is a fifth recent interpretation. In the experimental paradigm of cognitive neuroscience, we design empirical experiments that tend to confirm or refute aspects of experience. Let's say, where a brain scan shows electrochemical activity in a specific region of the brain thought to subserve a type of vision or emotion or motor control. Now, all these are the ways in which we can do some kind of phenomenological discussion or interpretation. Some of them are classical, where some of them are relatively modern in nature. Now let's talk about the awareness of the experience. What makes an experience conscious is a certain awareness one has of the experience while living through or performing it. This form of inner awareness has been a topic of considerable debate centuries after the issues arose with Locke's notion of self consciousness on the heels of Descartes' sense of consciousness. Does this awareness of experience consist in a kind of inner observation of the experience, as if one were doing two things at once? Well, Brentano argued no, absolutely not. It is always engaged with something out of our own self. Is it a higher order perception of one's mind's operation, or is it a higher order thought about one's mental activity? Well, recent theories have proposed both. Or is it a different form of inherent structure? Thinkers like Sartre took this line, drawing on Brentano and Husserl. For awareness of experience is a defining trait of conscious experience, the trait that gives experience a first person lived character. It is precisely this lived character of experience that allows a first person perspective on this object of study, namely experience. And that perspective is characteristic of the methodology of phenomenology. So here, when we talk about experience, we are talking about a conscious experience, a lived experience. Conscious experience is the starting point of phenomenology, but experience shades off into less overtly conscious phenomena. As Husserl and others stressed, we are only vaguely aware of things in the margin or periphery of attention, and we are only implicitly aware of the wider horizons of things in the world around us. Moreover, as Heidegger stressed, in practical activities like walking along, or hammering a nail, or speaking our native tongue, we are not explicitly conscious of our habitual patterns of action. Furthermore, as psychoanalysts have stressed, much of our intentional mental activity is not conscious at all, but may become conscious in the process of therapy or interrogation, as we come to realize how we feel or think about something. We should allow then that the domain of phenomenology, our own experience, is spreads out from conscious experience into semi conscious and even unconscious mental activity, along with relevant background conditions implicitly invoked in our experience. Well, these issues are subject to debate. The point here is to open the door to the question of where to draw the boundary of the domain of phenomenology. Now let's talk about some prominent classical thinkers related to the discipline of phenomenology. The very first name which comes to our mind is that of Edmund Husserl. A clear conception of phenomenology awaited Husserl's development of a clear model of intentionality. Indeed, phenomenology and the modern concept of intentionality emerged hand in hand in Husserl's Logical Investigations, which was published in 1900 or 1901. With theoretical foundations laid in the investigations, Husserl would then promote the radical new science of phenomenology in Ideas, published in 1913. Well, earlier it was known as a study of pure phenomenology. Later on, it was popularly known as ideas. An alternative vision of phenomenology would soon follow. Phenomenology came into its own with Husserl, much as epistemology came into its own with René Descartes, and ontology or metaphysics came into its own with Aristotle on the heels of Plato. Yet, phenomenology has been practiced with or without the name for many centuries. Now, this is the point to be emphasized. Though not directly but indirectly, we always have been a witness of the phenomenology as a discipline as well as a process. When Hindu and Buddhist philosophers reflected on a state of consciousness achieved in a variety of meditative states, were they not practicing phenomenology? They were. When Descartes, Hume, and Kant characterized stages of perception through thoughts and imagination, they were practicing phenomenology. When Brentano classified varieties of mental phenomena defined by directedness of consciousness, he was also practicing phenomenology. When William James appraised kinds of mental activity in the stream of consciousness, including their embodiment and their dependence on habit, he too was practicing phenomenology. And when recent analytical philosophers of mind have addressed issues of consciousness and intentionality, they have often been practicing phenomenology, though unknowingly. Still, the discipline of phenomenology, its roots tracing back through the centuries, come to full flower in Husserl. Now let's talk about the transcendental turn, which is quite crucial to the discipline of philosophy. In Ideas, Husserl presented phenomenology with a transcendental turn. In part, this means that Husserl took on the Kantian idiom of transcendental idealism, looking for conditions of the possibility of knowledge or of consciousness generally, and arguably turning away from any reality beyond phenomena. That's how the name comes, phenomenology. But Husserl's transcendental turn also involved his discovery of the method of epoche from the Greek skeptics' notion of abstraining from belief. We are to practice phenomenology, Husserl proposed, by bracketing the question of the existence of natural world around us. We thereby turn our attention in reflection to the structure of our own conscious experience. Our first key result is the observation that each act of consciousness is a consciousness of something that is intentional, that is directed towards something. Consider my visual experience wherein I see a tree across the square. In phenomenological reflection, we need not concern ourselves with whether the tree exists or not. My experience is of a tree, whether or not such a tree exists. However, we do need to concern ourselves with how the object is meant, how the object is intended. I see a eucalyptus tree, not a yucca tree. I see that object as a eucalyptus with a certain shape, with bark stripping off, etc. And thus, bracketing the tree itself, we turn our attention to my experience of the tree and specifically to the content or meaning in my own personal experience, what we call as the lived experience. This tree, as perceived, Husserl calls the noema or the noemetic sense of the experience. The second prominent thinker is Martin Heidegger. In a very different style, in clear analytical prose, in the text of a lecture course called The Basic Principles of Phenomenology, published in 1927, Heidegger traced the question of the meaning of being from Aristotle through many other thinkers into the issues of phenomenology. Our understanding of beings into their being comes ultimately through phenomenology, and here the connection with classical issues of ontology is more important and consonant with Husserl's view in the logical investigations. Coincidentally, it was an early source of inspiration for Heidegger as well. One of the Heidegger's most innovative ideas was his conception of the ground of being, looking to modes of being more fundamental than the things around us, including things from trees to hammers, anything. Heidegger questioned the contemporary concern with technology, and his writing might suggest that our scientific theories are historical artifacts that we use in technological practice rather than systems of ideal truth. Our deep understanding of being in our own case comes rather from phenomenology. This was what Heidegger held. Now we see that from these German thinkers, there is a gradual transition to the French culture, approach, and philosophy. In the 1930s, phenomenology migrated from Austrian and then German philosophy into French philosophy. The way had been paved in Marcus Proust in Search of Lost Time, in which the narrator recounts in close detail his vivid recollections of past experiences, including his famous association with the smell of freshly baked donuts. Now, this sensibility to experience traces to Descartes' work, and French phenomenology has been an effort to preserve the central thrust of Descartes' insights while rejecting mind body dualism. The experience of one's own body or one's lived or living ex body has been an important motif in many French philosophers of the 20th century. Well, in his well known novel Nausea, published in 1936, Jean-Paul Sartre described a bizarre course of experience in which the protagonist, writing in the first person, describes how ordinary objects lose their meaning until he encounters pure being at the foot of a chestnut tree and in that moment recovers his sense of his own freedom. And here comes Jean-Paul Sartre. In Being and Nothingness, published in 1943, written partly while a prisoner of war, Sartre developed his conception of phenomenological ontology. Consciousness is a consciousness of objects, as Husserl had stressed. In Sartre's model of intentionality, the central player in consciousness is a phenomena, and the occurrence of a phenomena just is a consciousness of an object. The chestnut tree I see is, for Sartre, such a phenomena in my consciousness. Indeed, all things in the world as we normally experience them are phenomena beneath or behind which lies their being in itself. Consciousness, by contrast, has being for itself, since each consciousness is not only a consciousness of its object, but also a pre-reflective consciousness of itself, which is called as conscience de soi. Yet, for Sartre, unlike Husserl, the I or the self is nothing but a sequence of acts or consciousness, notably including radically free choices, like a Humean bundle of perception. We all have studied that. And for Sartre, the practice of phenomenology proceeds by a deliberate reflection on the structures of consciousness. Sartre's method is in effect a literary style of interpretative description of different types of experiences in relevant situations. A practice that does not really fit the methodological proposal of either Husserl or Heidegger, but makes use of Sartre's great literary skills. Sartre's phenomenology in Being and Nothingness became the philosophical foundation for his popular philosophy of existentialism, sketched in his famous lecture Existentialism is a Humanism, published in 1945. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre emphasized the experience of freedom of choice, especially the project of choosing one's own self, the defining pattern of one's past actions. Through vivid descriptions of the look of the other, Sartre laid groundwork for the contemporary political significance of the concept of the other, as in other groups or other ethnicities. Indeed, in the second sex, 1949, Simone de Beauvoir launched contemporary feminism with her nuanced account of the perceived role of women as other. And here comes Maurice Merleau-Ponty. In 1940 Paris, Ponty joined with Sartre and Beauvoir in developing phenomenology. In Phenomenology of Perception in 1945, Ponty developed a rich variety of phenomenology emphasizing the role of the body in human experience. Unlike Husserl, Heidegger, and Sartre, Ponty looked to experimental psychology, analyzing the reported experience of amputees who felt sensations in a phantom limb. Ponty rejected both associationist psychology, focused on correlations between sensation and stimulus, and intellectualist psychology, focused on rational construction of the world in the mind. Instead, Ponty focused on the body image, our experience of our own body, and its significance in our activities. Extending Husserl's account of the lived body, Ponty resisted the traditional Cartesian separation of mind and body. For the body image is neither in the mental realm nor in the mechanical physical realm. Rather, my body is, as it were, me in my engaged actions with things I perceive, including other people. And conclusively, now we realize, as we promised in the beginning of the slides, as a core field of philosophy, phenomenology has got a more interesting, a more prominent status. Traditionally, as we all know, philosophy includes at least four core fields or disciplines: ontology, epistemology, ethics, and logic. Suppose phenomenology joins that list. Consider then that these elementary definitions of field. Ontology is the study of beings or their being. It means it questions what is. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, which means how we know or what are the means by which we know. Logic is the study of valid reasoning, which tells us how to reason, how to argue. Ethics is the study of right and wrong, which means how should we act. And with this comes phenomenology as the study of our experience, how we experience. The domains of study in these five fields are clearly, distinctly different, and they seem to call for different methods of study, and phenomenology is a very prominent one of them. It might seem interesting to our PhD scholars whether they are using analytical method or hermeneutics or phenomenological method, because the way we look at our research problem changes with the kind of methodology, with the kind of approach you implant, you impose in your research. That is why understanding the phenomenology as a method as well as a discipline becomes so crucial for all of you before you commit to using such a method in your research methodology. So that was all for today. Thank you for your patient listening. Please go through the given bibliography for further references in case you find it interesting. So thanks to all of you.